blood still crusted under White Eagle's fingernails from dragging the pregnant settler woman from the raging Colorado when 30 armed men surrounded his shelter, their rifle barrels gleaming like predators, teeth in the morning light. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The Colorado River carved its path through the rugged landscape with ancient patience, its waters reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. White Eagle stood motionless on the rocky overlook, his lean silhouette a solitary figure against the vast expanse of sky and earth. His eyes, dark and watchful, scanned the horizon with the precision of a man who had learned to read nature's subtle language. The year was 1878, and for the Apache hunter, time was measured not in months or years, but in the cycles of the moon, the migration of animals, and the changing of seasons. His buckskin garments, worn smooth by wind and weather, bore the subtle marks of a life lived close to the land. A single eagle feather hung from his long black hair, a reminder of the vision that had given him his name during the ceremony of his youth. That seemed like another lifetime now, before the soldiers came, before the sound of gunfire replaced the songs of his people. White Eagle adjusted the knife at his belt and gathered the rabbits he had caught earlier. The meat would last him several days if he smoked it properly. He had built his small shelter away from the main trails, hidden in a grove of cottonwoods near a bend in the river. It was a simple place. A sturdy lean-to of timber and brush, a fire pit lined with river stones, and a small rack for drying meat and herbs. Not a home, but a place to exist. Another day, he murmured to himself in his native tongue, words carried away by the wind. At 28, White Eagle had already lived longer than many of his brothers. He had survived the raids, the diseases, the brutal winter when the army had driven his band from their ancestral hunting grounds. But survival came at a cost: solitude. He had chosen this life apart, unable to bear the reservation where his remaining people had been forced to settle, yet unwilling to join the bands of warriors who still fought a war they could not win. As he descended the rocky path toward his camp, the first raindrops began to fall, heavy and deliberate. The storm had been building throughout the afternoon, dark clouds massing on the western horizon like an army preparing for battle. White Eagle quickened his pace. The spring storms could turn violent with little warning, transforming the placid river into a raging torrent. By the time he reached his shelter, the sky had darkened to a threatening gray-purple, and the rain fell in earnest, drumming against the earth with growing insistence. Lightning split the sky, followed by the deep rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. White Eagle secured the covering of his shelter and began preparing his catch, working by the light of a small fire protected from the elements. As the storm intensified, the river's voice changed, rising from a gentle murmur to an angry roar. White Eagle had seen the river flood its banks before, carrying away anything in its path: trees, animals, even the wooden homes of settlers foolish enough to build too close to its reach. Tonight would be such a night. He added more wood to his fire and settled back, listening to the elemental fury outside. Then, barely audible above the storm's wrath, he heard it, a human cry, desperate and faint. White Eagle stiffened, his senses immediately alert. Again it came, a woman's voice calling for help, carried on the wind between thunderclaps. Without hesitation, he grabbed his knife and a coiled rope of braided leather and ducked out into the deluge. Rain lashed at his face as he ran toward the sound, guided more by instinct than by sight in the gathering darkness. The river had already breached its banks, water churning brown and violent, carrying branches and debris in its swollen current. And there, in the middle of the torrent, clinging to what appeared to be part of a wagon wheel, was a woman. Even from the shore, White Eagle could see her face, pale with terror in a flash of lightning, her golden hair plastered to her head by the rain. But what made his heart constrict was the sight of her swollen belly. She was with child. "Hold on!" he shouted in English, one of the few phrases he knew in the language of the white settlers. The woman's eyes found him, wide with desperation and hope. "Please!" she cried, her voice breaking. "Help me!" White Eagle scanned the riverbank, quickly assessing his options. The current was too strong to wade in directly. He would need to enter upstream and let the river carry him to her. Tying one end of his rope to a sturdy tree trunk, he secured the other around his waist. Then, with a deep breath, he plunged into the churning waters. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. The current immediately seized him, pulling him downstream with frightening power. White Eagle fought to keep his head above water, using strong strokes to guide his path toward the stranded woman. The rope around his waist grew taut, anchoring him against the river's relentless pull. He could see her more clearly now, young, perhaps 20 summers, her face a mask of exhaustion and fear. Her grip on the wagon wheel was weakening, her strength nearly spent. White Eagle pushed harder against the current, his muscles burning with effort. "I am coming," he called to her. "Do not let go." The woman nodded weakly, her eyes never leaving his approach. White Eagle could read the doubt in her expression. An Apache warrior was coming to her rescue, a man her people likely feared and despised. But drowning made strange allies, and in this moment they were simply two humans against the river's wrath. The distance between them closed with agonizing slowness. White Eagle could see the woman's fingers, white-knuckled and trembling as they gripped the waterlogged wood. With each passing second, her hold weakened. A massive branch hurtled past, missing her by inches, and she cried out in terror. "Look at me," White Eagle commanded, his voice carrying over the storm's fury. "Only at me." Their eyes locked, hers blue as the summer sky, filled with fear, but also a fierce determination that he recognized. This woman was fighting for two lives. With a final, powerful thrust against the current, White Eagle reached her side. The makeshift raft of wagon parts to which she clung shifted treacherously beneath them. "I will help you," he said, his English halting but clear. "Put arms around my neck." The woman hesitated for only a moment before releasing her death grip on the wood. As she reached for him, the raft tilted suddenly. She slipped, a scream tearing from her throat as the current pulled at her skirts. White Eagle lunged forward, catching her wrist in an iron grip. With one powerful movement, he pulled her against his chest, feeling the swell of her belly press against him. Her skin was cold as river stones. "Hold tight," he instructed, securing his arm around her waist. With his free hand, he gripped the rope that tethered him to the shore. "I pull us now." Hand over hand, fighting the river's rage, White Eagle began the arduous journey back to the bank. The woman clung to him, her face pressed against his shoulder, her body shivering violently. The rope cut into his palm, blood mixing with rainwater, but he didn't slacken his pace. Twice they went under, the current attempting to claim them, but each time White Eagle fought back to the surface, keeping the woman's head above water. Finally, his feet found purchase on the muddy riverbed. With the last of his strength, he half-carried, half-dragged the woman onto the shore, collapsing beside her on the rain-soaked ground. For a moment, they simply lay there, gasping for breath, the enormity of their survival washing over them. The woman was the first to speak, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Thank you. You saved us." White Eagle nodded, rising unsteadily to his feet. The storm still raged, and the woman needed shelter and warmth immediately. Without asking permission, he scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, despite her pregnancy. "My camp," he explained, already moving. "Not far." She didn't protest, either from trust or exhaustion. Her head lolled against his shoulder as he carried her through the darkness, navigating by memory and instinct through the driving rain. By the time they reached his shelter, her eyes had closed and her breathing had grown shallow. Inside, the fire had dimmed but not died. White Eagle gently laid the woman on his sleeping mat of rabbit furs near the warmth. Her dress was sodden, clinging to her swollen form. Her face, illuminated by the firelight, was alarmingly pale, lips tinged with blue. "Must get dry," he told her, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "A decold will kill." With efficient movements, White Eagle built up the fire, its light casting dancing shadows across the small space. From a cedar box, he retrieved a woolen blanket, traded months ago for 3 beaver pelts. It was his only one, rarely used except in the deepest winter. The woman's eyes fluttered open as he knelt beside her. "My baby," she whispered, hands moving protectively to her belly. "Please, baby safe," White Eagle assured her, though he couldn't know for certain. "Need to take wet clothes to save you both." Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by a flash of modesty, but pragmatism quickly won. She nodded weakly. With respectful efficiency, White Eagle helped her remove the sodden outer dress and petticoats, leaving her in a thin chemise. He averted his eyes as much as possible, maintaining her dignity. The blanket went around her immediately, its rough warmth a stark contrast to the clinging cold of her garments. "My name is Sarah," she said through chattering teeth as he hung her clothes near the fire to dry. "Sarah Mitchell." White Eagle nodded in acknowledgement. "White Eagle," he replied, tapping his chest. "My husband," Sarah continued, her voice strengthening slightly. "Thomas, we were crossing the wagon." Her face crumpled with the memory. "The horses panicked. The current, it was so fast." White Eagle moved to a small collection of pouches hanging from the shelter's support beam. He selected several, bringing them to the fireside. "Rest now," he said. "I'll talk later." From the pouches, he extracted dried herbs, willow bark for pain and fever, sage for cleansing, and a rare root known among his people for protecting mothers and unborn children. With practiced hands, he crushed them into a wooden cup, adding hot water from a pot kept warm by the fire's edge. As the medicinal tea steeped, White Eagle examined Sarah more carefully. Bruises were forming on her arms and face where she had struck debris in the water. Her breathing was labored but steady. Most concerning was her temperature. Despite the fire and blanket, she continued to shiver violently. "Drink," he instructed, helping her sit up slightly. He held the cup to her lips. Sarah hesitated, eyeing the dark liquid. "What is it?" "Medicine," he explained simply. "Help pain." "Help baby." Trust warred with caution in her expression. Finally, she took a small sip, grimacing at the bitter taste. White Eagle nodded encouragingly, and she continued until the cup was empty. "Thomas will be looking for me," she murmured, her eyelids growing heavy as the herbs began to take effect. "We were traveling to Willow Creek. New life." Her words trailed off as exhaustion claimed her. White Eagle pulled the blanket more securely around her shoulders. He knew of Willow Creek, a small settlement about 20 miles downriver, one of many springing up across the territory. He had avoided it, as he avoided all places where the white man gathered in numbers. Outside, the storm continued its assault, rain drumming against the shelter's roof. White Eagle added more wood to the fire, preparing for a long night. He would need to stay vigilant for Sarah's condition, for the river's rise, and for the possibility that others might be searching for the missing woman. As Sarah fell into a fitful sleep, White Eagle settled cross-legged nearby, his knife within reach. He had no illusions about what it meant for an Apache man to be found with a white woman in his care, even one he had rescued. Such misunderstandings had led to bloodshed before. Yet he could not have left her to the river's mercy. That was not the way of his people, no matter what the white settlers might believe. Life was sacred, especially that of a mother and unborn child. In the flickering firelight, White Eagle studied Sarah's face, now relaxed in sleep. She was young, younger than he had first thought, with features that reminded him of a deer, delicate but strong. Her golden hair, beginning to dry in the fire's warmth, spread across the furs like sunlight on water. "May the spirits watch over you," he whispered in his native tongue, "until your man comes." Dawn arrived with tentative fingers of light creeping through the cracks in the shelter's walls. The storm had spent its fury during the night, leaving behind a world washed clean. Birds had begun their morning songs, and the scent of rain-soaked earth filled the air. The river, though still swollen and quick, no longer roared with murderous intent. White Eagle had not slept. Throughout the night, he had maintained the fire, checked on Sarah's breathing, and prepared more medicine when her sleep grew restless. Twice, he had ventured outside to ensure the river hadn't risen further, and to listen for the sounds of searchers. But only the wilderness had greeted him, vast and indifferent to the human drama unfolding within its bounds. Sarah stirred as the light strengthened, her eyelids fluttering before opening fully. For a moment, confusion clouded her features as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings, the hide walls of the shelter, the smoldering fire, the strange implements hanging from wooden pegs. Then her gaze found White Eagle sitting cross-legged nearby, and memory flooded back. "It wasn't a dream," she murmured, her voice raspy from sleep and ordeal. White Eagle shook his head. "No dream." He offered her a wooden cup filled with fresh water. "Drink." Sarah pushed herself up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs. The woolen blanket fell away slightly, and she quickly drew it back around her shoulders, suddenly aware of her state of undress. She accepted the water gratefully, drinking deeply before speaking again. "My baby." Her hand moved protectively to her swollen belly. In answer, White Eagle reached for a small pouch. From it, he produced a smooth stone, polished by time and water, with a natural hole through its center. He held it out to her. "Listen," he instructed. Hesitantly, Sarah took the stone. White Eagle gestured for her to place it against her belly and put her ear close. Curious, she followed his direction. After a moment, her face transformed with wonder. "I can hear the heartbeat," she whispered, tears springing to her eyes. "Strong and fast." White Eagle nodded, a rare smile briefly softening his stoic features. Strong spirit in there. "Fighter like mother." Sarah handed the stone back, wiping away tears with the edge of the blanket. "How did you know to do that?" "My grandmother," he replied, returning the stone to its pouch. "She was medicine woman, taught me many things before soldiers came." A shadow passed over his face, and Sarah sensed the weight of unspoken history. She had heard stories of conflicts between the army and the Apache tribes, brutal tales told in hushed voices around settler campfires. But sitting here with the man who had risked his life to save hers, those stories seemed distant and one-sided. "Your clothes," White Eagle said, breaking the moment of reflection. He gestured to her dress and petticoats, now dry but crumpled, hanging from a makeshift line near the fire. "Sun is up." "Husband will look for you." "Yes," Sarah agreed, reality reasserting itself. Thomas will be frantic. We were meant to reach Willow Creek by nightfall yesterday. Her brow furrowed with worry. He might think I'm dead. River took wagon, White Eagle confirmed. But not you. He stood and moved toward the shelter's entrance. I will step outside. You dress. Once alone, Sarah rose carefully, testing her limbs. Everything ached. Bruises from the river's battering covered her arms and legs, but she was alive, and so was her child. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling a reassuring kick in response. We're safe, she murmured. Thanks to him. She dressed quickly, grateful that her clothes had dried overnight. The simple cotton dress, though wrinkled and stained with river mud, provided a return to normalcy, to the life she had known before the waters had nearly claimed her. As she fastened the last button, she noticed her reflection in a small piece of polished metal hanging from one of the shelter's supports. Her face was pale, her hair tangled, but her eyes held a new resilience. White Eagle returned carrying several small fish, freshly caught from the river that had nearly become her grave. He nodded with approval at seeing her dressed and standing. You eat, he stated simply, moving to prepare the fish. Need strength. Thank you, Sarah said, watching as he skillfully gutted and skewered the fish with practiced movements. For everything, my husband and I. We owe you our lives. White Eagle did not respond immediately, focused on positioning the fish over the rekindled fire. Finally, he spoke without looking up. No debt would do same for any life in danger. Even a settler? Sarah asked quietly. His dark eyes met hers then, intense and unreadable. Life is life. Apache way teaches respect for all that breathes. Not all white men understand this. Sarah lowered herself carefully onto a flat rock near the fire. No, she agreed softly. Not all do. After a pause, she added, I don't know much about your people, only what I've heard, and I suspect much of it isn't true. White Eagle turned the fish, the flesh beginning to brown over the flames. Much blood between our peoples. Truth drowns in blood. They sat in silence as the fish cooked, the simple shelter filled with the aroma of the morning meal. Outside, the wilderness continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the human concerns within. Why do you live alone? Sarah asked finally. Are there not others of your tribe nearby? Pain flashed briefly across White Eagle's features before his expression became impassive once more. My family killed 3 summers ago. Army attack on village while men away hunting, wife, daughter, mother, all gone. His voice remained steady, but his hands stilled momentarily. Some of my people went to reservation, others fight still. I choose different path. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered, understanding for the first time the depth of solitude in which this man existed. White Eagle removed the fish from the fire, dividing the simple meal between 2 bark plates. He handed one to Sarah. Your husband, he said, changing the subject. He will come looking soon. What kind of man is he? Sarah accepted the plate, considering the question. He's a good man, kind, hard-working. We came west for a new beginning. He's to be the schoolmaster in Willow Creek. She smiled slightly. He believes education is the future of the frontier. White Eagle nodded, his expression thoughtful as he began to eat. A good man with gun still dangerous when afraid for wife. The implication was clear, and Sarah felt a chill despite the morning warmth. What would happen when Thomas found her here, in the care of an Apache warrior? Thomas Mitchell had not slept. His eyes, reddened from strain and unshed tears, scanned the riverbank with desperate intensity. The storm had delayed their search through the night, forcing the men to take shelter in a rocky overhang a mile upriver. But with the first pale light of dawn, they had resumed their grim task, following the swollen Colorado downstream. "Mitchell!" called a voice from ahead. Sheriff Dawson, a weathered man with a silver-streaked beard and a Colt revolver holstered at his hip, waved urgently from a bend in the river. "And over here!" Thomas's heart lurched as he broke into a run, boots sliding on the mud-slicked ground. Behind him came the sound of other men moving, 30 in all, settlers from Willow Creek who had responded to his desperate plea for help when he'd arrived alone the previous evening, his wagon and wife nowhere to be found. As he rounded the bend, Thomas saw it, the remains of his wagon, half submerged in the muddy water, splintered wood jutting from the surface like broken bones. One of the horses lay dead on the shore, its body tangled in the harness. Of the other horse and Sarah, there was no sign. "Oh God," Thomas whispered, his knees weakening. He was a tall man, lean and scholarly in appearance, with wire-rimmed spectacles and sandy hair that fell across his forehead. At 32, he had the look of someone more accustomed to books than hardship, though the past year of frontier life had begun to weather his once smooth features. Now, staring at the wreckage, he appeared to age another decade in moments. Sheriff Dawson placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Don't lose hope yet, Mitchell. We haven't found her, which means she might have made it to shore downstream." Thomas nodded numbly, clinging to that slim thread of possibility. "Sarah's a strong swimmer, and she's resourceful. If anyone could survive—" "That's the spirit," Dawson affirmed, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. A pregnant woman in a raging river, the odds were not favorable. He turned to the assembled men, raising his voice. "Jenkins, Taylor, see if there's anything worth salvaging from the wagon. The rest of you, spread out along both banks, quarter-mile intervals. Look for any sign, footprints, torn fabric, anything." The men dispersed with grim efficiency, many of them hardened frontiersmen who had seen nature's cruelty firsthand. Thomas remained frozen, staring at the ruined wagon that had contained all their worldly possessions, books for his teaching, Sarah's family heirlooms, tools for their new life. All gone, but none of it mattered if Sarah was lost too. "Come on, Mitchell," Dawson urged. "You take the north bank with me. Standing here won't find her." For the next hour, they combed the riverside, eyes scanning for any trace of the missing woman. The river had begun to recede, revealing debris caught in the underbrush, branches, a wooden barrel, part of a chair, but no sign of Sarah. It was a young trapper named Wilkins who found the first clue. "Tracks!" he called from a muddy stretch of bank nearly 2 miles downstream from the wagon. "And they ain't animal." The men converged on the spot. Clear in the soft mud were footprints, a man's moccasins, pressing deep as if carrying weight, leading away from the river's edge. "These ain't settlers' boots," observed Jenkins, a grizzled farmer with a perpetual scowl. "Look at the pattern. Indian." A ripple of tension passed through the group. Thomas felt his blood run cold. "Apache?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Sheriff Dawson knelt, examining the tracks. "Most likely. They're the main tribe in these parts." He stood, his hand moving instinctively to rest on his revolver. "And there's something else. See these other marks alongside? Drag marks. He was carrying something, or someone." The implication hung in the air like gun smoke. Thomas's face drained of color. "If they've taken her—" "Now hold on," Dawson cautioned, though his expression had hardened. "We don't know anything for certain. Could be he found her already dead, or alive," Thomas insisted, a desperate edge to his voice. "Either way, we need to follow these tracks. Now." The men murmured their agreement, hands tightening on rifle stocks. The mood had shifted from search to hunt, an undercurrent of anger replacing the somber determination of before. "If it's Apaches, we need to be smart about this," Dawson warned. "They know this territory better than any of us. Could be walking into an ambush." "I don't care," Thomas declared, a new resolve hardening his scholarly features. "If there's even a chance Sarah's alive, we'll find her," Dawson assured him, signaling to the men to check their weapons. "But we do it my way, organized, careful." He turned to the assembled searchers. "Anyone not comfortable with this turn, head back to town now. The rest of you form up." 5-man teams, staggered approach. No one left. These were frontier men, many with families of their own. The thought of a woman, especially one carrying a child, in the hands of those they considered savages, was enough to steel even the most cautious heart. Thomas found a Winchester rifle pressed into his hands by Jenkins. "Ever fired one of these, schoolmaster?" the farmer asked, not unkindly. Thomas nodded grimly. "My father taught me. Though I never thought I'd aim at a man." Jenkins clapped him on the shoulder. "Pray you won't have to, but if it comes to it, remember, it's for your wife and child." The tracks led away from the river, winding through a grove of cottonwoods and up a gentle slope toward a secluded hollow screened by brush and rock formations. Dawson led them carefully, signaling for silence as they approached. The men spread out in a practiced formation, rifles ready, moving with the caution of those who respected their adversary's skill. Thomas's heart pounded so loudly he was certain everyone could hear it. The rifle felt alien in his hands, its weight a reminder of how unprepared he was for this harsh reality. He had come west with dreams of building a school, of shaping young minds on the frontier. Now he stalked through the wilderness, prepared to kill for the chance to see Sarah again. As they crested the rise, Dawson held up a hand, halting the advance. Through the brush, they could make out a small clearing, and within it, a simple lean-to shelter nestled against a rocky outcropping. Smoke rose in a thin column from a fire pit outside. Someone was there. "That's no Apache camp," whispered Jenkins. "Just one shelter." "Maybe a scout or a hunter." Dawson nodded in agreement. "We surround it. No one fires unless I give the word." He fixed Thomas with a stern gaze. "Especially you, Mitchell. If your wife is in there, last thing we want is a stray bullet finding her." Thomas swallowed hard and nodded, though his grip on the rifle tightened. The men moved forward silently, encircling the small camp with practiced efficiency. Thomas's eyes never left the shelter's entrance, covered by what appeared to be a tanned deer hide. Was Sarah behind it? Was she alive? And if so, what had she endured through the long night? Dawson, now positioned behind a large boulder 20 yards from the shelter, raised his hand, then dropped it in a sharp signal. "Come out!" he bellowed, his voice echoing across the clearing. "You're surrounded!" "Send out the woman, and no harm will come to you." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Thomas held his breath, finger trembling against the rifle's trigger guard. Inside the shelter, White Eagle had gone completely still, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. His keen ears had detected the men's approach long before Dawson's shout. The rustle of clothing, the metallic click of rifle hammers being drawn back, the whispered commands. He had hoped to avoid this moment, but had known it was inevitable. Sarah's face had drained of color. "It's Thomas," she whispered, recognizing her husband's voice among the men outside. And others. Her eyes met White Eagle's, fear and urgency mingling in her gaze. They think you've taken me prisoner." White Eagle nodded once, his expression grave. "Stay here," he instructed quietly. "I go out first. Show empty hands." "No!" Sarah grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. They'll shoot you before you can explain." "Then what?" he asked simply. Sarah's mind raced. She knew the tensions between settlers and Apaches in the territory, the fear, the mistrust, the bloody history that colored every interaction. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and this man who had saved her life would be dead. "I'll go first," she decided, already struggling to rise. "Let them see I'm unharmed." Outside, Dawson's voice rang out again, edged with menace. "Last chance. Come out now or we're coming in shooting." "Wait," Sarah called, her voice cracking with strain. "Thomas, I'm coming out. Don't shoot." A stunned silence fell over the clearing. Thomas's heart leaped at the sound of his wife's voice. "Sarah!" he cried, half rising from his position before Dawson's restraining hand pushed him back down. "Could be forced to say that," the sheriff warned, though doubt had crept into his expression. Inside the shelter, Sarah turned to White Eagle. "Promise me you'll stay back until I've explained everything." The Apache warrior studied her face for a long moment, then inclined his head in agreement. "I trust you," he said simply. Those 3 words carried a weight Sarah felt in her chest, the trust of a man who had little reason to trust anyone, especially those who looked like her. She would not betray it. With careful movements, Sarah pushed aside the hide covering and stepped into the morning light, one hand raised in a placating gesture, the other resting protectively on her swollen belly. "Thomas," she called, her eyes searching the surrounding brush. "I'm unharmed. Please tell everyone to lower their weapons." "Sarah!" Thomas broke from cover, ignoring Dawson's hissed warning. He ran toward his wife, rifle forgotten in his haste. When he reached her, his hands hovered over her as if afraid she might shatter, his eyes wide with disbelief and joy. "My God, you're alive! I thought when I found the wagon—" "I know," she soothed, taking his trembling hands in hers. "But I'm safe. The baby's safe." Her eyes moved past him to the armed men now cautiously rising from their positions, weapons still trained on the shelter. "And thanks to him," Thomas followed her gaze, confusion replacing relief. "Him." Sarah turned toward the shelter entrance. "You can come out," she called softly. "It's all right." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, deliberately, White Eagle emerged. He wore no weapons visibly, his hands held palm outward at chest height in the universal gesture of peace. His face was impassive, but his eyes were alert, taking in the ring of armed men with calm assessment. A ripple of tension passed through the search party, several rifles raised higher. "Hold your fire!" Dawson ordered sharply, though his own hand remained on his revolver. Thomas instinctively stepped in front of Sarah, shielding her with his body. "Get back," he warned, reaching for the pistol tucked into his belt. "No." Sarah moved around him, placing herself between her husband and White Eagle. "Thomas, listen to me. This man saved my life. He pulled me from the river when our wagon overturned. He carried me to safety, treated my injuries, kept me warm through the night." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I would be dead, our child would be dead if not for him." Thomas stared at her, then at the Apache warrior standing calmly behind her. Doubt warred with ingrained suspicion on his face. "It's true," Sarah insisted, taking his hand and placing it on her belly, where the baby kicked as if in affirmation. "He could have left me to drown. Instead, he risked his own life." She turned to include the other men in her appeal. "He deserves our gratitude, not our guns." Dawson stepped forward, his weathered face unreadable as he studied White Eagle. "That true, Apache?" "You fished her out of the river." White Eagle met his gaze steadily. She was drowning. Her child, too. What man would not help? The simple dignity of the response seemed to catch Dawson off guard. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded firmly. "He made me medicine when I was chilled to the bone." she added. He gave me his only blanket, kept watch all night to ensure I was recovering. Her voice softened. He showed me how to hear my baby's heartbeat with a special stone. This last detail, so intimate and unexpected, seemed to penetrate Thomas's shock. He looked at his wife, truly looked at her, and saw the conviction in her eyes. Slowly, his hand fell away from his pistol. I don't understand, he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Everything we've heard about the Apache is not everything there is to know, Sarah finished gently. Dawson signaled to his men, who reluctantly lowered their weapons, though they remained watchful. The tension in the clearing decreased by degrees, like a drawn bowstring gradually released. Well, the sheriff said finally, removing his hat and running a hand through his graying hair, this is a turn I didn't expect. He nodded toward White Eagle. Seems we owe you a debt, mister. White Eagle, Sarah supplied. His name is White Eagle. A heavy silence settled over the clearing as the armed men processed this unexpected turn of events. White Eagle remained perfectly still, his expression neutral, though his eyes missed nothing. The reluctance with which some men lowered their rifles, the suspicious glances exchanged, the protective way Thomas kept one arm around Sarah. Sheriff Dawson cleared his throat, clearly navigating unfamiliar territory. Well then, he said gruffly, replacing his hat, White Eagle, on behalf of the people of Willow Creek, I extend our gratitude for your assistance to Mrs. Mitchell. White Eagle inclined his head slightly but said nothing. He understood the cost of those words to a man like Dawson, whose life had likely been shaped by conflict with native tribes. Thomas Mitchell still looked dazed, his eyes moving between his wife and her rescuer as if unable to reconcile their existence in the same space. I don't know what to say, he finally managed, his scholarly manner reasserting itself despite the circumstances. Thank you seems insufficient. No debt, White Eagle replied, echoing what he had told Sarah earlier. Would do same again. The simplicity of the statement hung in the air, challenging the complex prejudices and fears that had defined relations between their peoples for generations. Sarah, sensing the fragility of the moment, stepped forward. I need to sit down, she said, one hand moving to the small of her back. The strain of the ordeal was finally catching up to her. The men reacted immediately. Thomas guided her to a flat rock near the fire pit, his face creased with concern. One of the settlers produced a canteen, which she accepted gratefully. White Eagle moved quietly to the side, allowing them space while remaining visible. A deliberate choice, Sarah realized, to avoid appearing threatening. Mrs. Mitchell, Dawson began, crouching to meet her at eye level. I know you've been through a terrible ordeal, but we need to head back to town. Can you manage the journey? Before Sarah could respond, White Eagle spoke. River still high at crossing. Need to go south. Shallow ford 3 miles down. Several men tensed at his words, hands twitching toward weapons. Dawson turned slowly, eyebrows raised. You know another crossing? White Eagle nodded. Safe for horses, not for wagon. Our horses are half a mile back, Dawson said, studying the Apache with newfound interest. And we brought a mount for Mrs. Mitchell, assuming. He trailed off, the grim assumption hanging unspoken. I can ride, Sarah assured them, though Thomas looked doubtful. Jenkins, the grizzled farmer, stepped forward unexpectedly. My Nell had our youngest on horseback 2 days after birthing him, he offered. And frontier women are made of stern stuff. This brought a ripple of agreement from the other men, along with the first tentative smiles since the confrontation began. The atmosphere in the clearing shifted subtly, not quite relaxed, but no longer balanced on a knife's edge. "And if you'll permit," Thomas said to White Eagle, the formal phrasing revealing his educational background, "we'd like to gather Sarah's things before departing." White Eagle gestured toward the shelter. "Little to gather. Medicine pouch by fire. Good for mother and child." Sarah rose carefully, leaning on Thomas's arm. "I'd like him to come with us," she said quietly, but with unmistakable resolve. A stunned silence followed her words. Thomas stared at her, confusion evident in his expression. "Sarah, I don't think just to the edge of town," she clarified. "He saved my life, Thomas. The least we can do is ensure he reaches safety." Her eyes sought White Eagle's. "There may be other search parties, men who won't wait for explanations." Dawson frowned, but there was reluctant understanding in his weathered face. "She's not wrong," he admitted. "Word spreads fast, and not always accurately. Some trigger-happy fool might shoot first if they come across a lone Apache in these parts." Thomas looked torn, his natural compassion warring with deeply ingrained caution. He studied White Eagle, who had remained impassive throughout the exchange. "Would you come with us?" Thomas finally asked. "At least until we're past the ford." For the first time, surprise flickered across White Eagle's features. He had expected many outcomes from this confrontation: violence, grudging tolerance, hasty departures, but not an invitation. "I will guide you to ford," he agreed after a moment's consideration, "then return to my path." The decision made, the camp was quickly dismantled. White Eagle gathered the few belongings he deemed essential: his knife, a small bundle of dried herbs, a water skin, and the medicine pouch he had prepared for Sarah. Everything else could be replaced or reconstructed. Sarah ducked into the shelter one last time, emerging with the woolen blanket that had warmed her through the night. She folded it carefully and approached White Eagle. "This is she said, offering it to him. "I'm grateful for its warmth." White Eagle shook his head. "Keep for child," he said simply. "Winter will come again." Sarah's eyes welled with tears. The gift, practical yet deeply meaningful, touched her more than flowery speeches ever could. "Thank you," she whispered. The party set off shortly after, White Eagle leading the way along a narrow trail that wound through the cottonwoods toward the river. Most of the men followed at a distance, their initial hostility tempered by confusion and reluctant respect. Dawson walked closer, his lawman's instincts still sharp, but his hand no longer hovered near his weapon. Thomas helped Sarah onto a gentle mare, then mounted his own horse, staying close beside her. As they rode, he studied the straight-backed figure of White Eagle moving soundlessly ahead of them. The Apache's knowledge of the terrain was evident in every sure step, every confident turn along the path. "He's lived out here alone for some time," Sarah explained quietly, noticing Thomas's interest. "His family was killed 3 years ago in an army attack." Thomas winced. "Sarah, I know," she interrupted gently. "It's not your fault, not mine either, but he still saved me, Thomas. Despite everything his people have suffered at the hands of ours." The weight of her words settled over Thomas like a physical burden. He had come west with such clear convictions, such certainty about bringing civilization and education to the frontier. Now, confronted with the simple nobility of White Eagle's actions, those convictions seemed suddenly simplistic, even arrogant. As they approached the river, White Eagle paused, waiting for the group to catch up. The Colorado still ran high and fast, its waters brown with silt, but ahead lay a broader, shallower stretch where gravel bars broke the surface. "Cross here," White Eagle instructed, pointing to the natural ford. "Water no higher than horse's knee, firm bottom." Dawson surveyed the crossing with a professional eye. "Looks good," he acknowledged, nodding to White Eagle. "You've saved us a 10-mile detour. Much obliged." It was the first time the sheriff had addressed the Apache directly without suspicion or challenge. A small step, perhaps, but significant. The crossing began with White Eagle leading the way, stepping carefully into the rushing water to demonstrate the safest path. The river tugged at his legs, but he moved with practiced confidence, pausing occasionally to point out submerged hazards to those who followed. "Keep to the right of that boulder," he called back, his voice carrying over the water's roar. "Current pulls strong on left side." Dawson went next, then directed two of his most experienced men to help Sarah's horse across. Thomas rode beside her, one hand ready to steady her if needed. The rest of the party followed in small groups, weapons slung high across their shoulders to keep the powder dry. Sarah couldn't help but notice how the men now listened to White Eagle's instructions without question or hesitation. The same expertise that had saved her life now guided them all to safety. As her horse navigated the ford, water splashing up to its knees just as White Eagle had predicted, she felt a surge of vindication. Here was proof of what she had told them. This man was not the savage of frontier nightmares, but a skilled survivor whose knowledge deserved respect. When everyone had reached the far bank without incident, there was a subtle shift in the group's dynamic. Several men nodded acknowledgement to White Eagle. Jenkins even approached him directly, offering a strip of jerky from his provisions. "Good eye for water crossings," the farmer remarked gruffly. "And saved us trouble." White Eagle accepted the offering with dignity. "River speaks to those who listen," he replied. "Changes voice with seasons." Jenkins considered this, then nodded as if something profound had been confirmed. "My granddaddy used to say something similar. Said a man who can't read water has no business living near it." It was a small exchange, unremarkable in many ways, yet Sarah recognized its significance, a moment of connection across the chasm of cultural difference, built on shared practical wisdom rather than abstract ideals. The journey continued through the late morning, the group making good time along a game trail that White Eagle identified as a shorter route to the main road. The day had warmed considerably, spring sunshine burning away the last evidence of the storm. Birds called from the trees, and once a deer bounded across their path, startling several horses. Thomas rode up beside White Eagle, who had maintained a solitary position at the front of the procession. For several minutes they traveled in silence, the scholarly settler clearly gathering his thoughts. "My wife tells me you lost your family," Thomas finally said, his voice low enough that only White Eagle could hear. The Apache's expression didn't change, but his shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly. "3 summers ago, army attack on village." Thomas swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," he offered, the words feeling painfully inadequate. "No one should endure such loss." White Eagle looked at him then, truly looked at him, as if measuring the sincerity behind the condolence. "Your woman, she carries new life, new hope. Protect her well." "I will," Thomas promised, then hesitated before adding, "though it seems I failed at that yesterday." "River decides who lives, who dies," White Eagle replied, with simple fatalism. "Not your doing." Thomas considered this perspective, so different from his own belief in man's ability to control his destiny through preparation and education. Yet there was wisdom in acknowledging nature's ultimate authority, especially on the frontier. "I'm to be the schoolmaster in Willow Creek," Thomas said, changing the subject. "And teaching children, settler children mostly, though there are some from Mexican families and a few freed slaves who've come west." He paused. "There are no Indian children in the school." White Eagle's expression remained neutral. "Your schools teach white man's ways, not our ways." "Yes," Thomas acknowledged, but perhaps they should teach both. The idea formed as he spoke it, surprising him with its clarity. The children of the frontier will inherit this land. Shouldn't they understand all its peoples? White Eagle studied him with newfound interest. Bold words, teacher. Many would not agree. Many don't, Thomas admitted with a rueful smile. But after today, he glanced back at Sarah, riding comfortably now, deep in conversation with Jenkins' wife who had joined the search party. Now I find my perspective somewhat altered. As they talked, the landscape gradually changed. The wild river valley gave way to scattered homesteads, rough cabins with smoke rising from stone chimneys, fenced plots of newly tilled earth, the occasional orchard of young fruit trees struggling to establish themselves in the challenging soil, signs of settlement, of civilization pushing steadily westward. White Eagle noted each one, his eyes cataloguing the changes to the land he had once known as wilderness. He did not comment, but Thomas sensed his awareness of what these humble dwellings represented. The inexorable advance of a way of life that had little room for the Apache and their traditions. By early afternoon, they crested a gentle rise, and the settlement of Willow Creek came into view in the valley below. It was a modest frontier town, a main street lined with false-fronted wooden buildings, a church steeple rising from one end, a cluster of homes spreading outward like ripples in a pond. Smoke rose from the blacksmith's forge, and even at this distance, they could make out the movements of people going about their daily business, unaware of the drama that had unfolded in the wilderness beyond their doorsteps. Dawson, who had been riding near the rear of the group, spurred his horse forward to join Thomas and White Eagle at the vanguard. His expression was troubled as he gazed down at the town. "This is where we part ways," he said to White Eagle, his tone respectful but firm. "Folks in town, they won't understand what happened out here. They'll just see an Apache," White Eagle finished for him. "I know." Sarah, noticing the exchange, urged her horse forward. "Surely we can explain—" "No, Mrs. Mitchell," Dawson interrupted gently. "Some things can't be explained away, not with the history between our people still raw." He turned to White Eagle. "It's not right, but it's the way things stand." White Eagle nodded, unsurprised. "In my path lies elsewhere." Thomas looked between his wife and the man who had saved her, clearly torn between gratitude and pragmatism. "At least let us offer you provisions," he suggested, "or payment for your help." "No payment," White Eagle declined firmly, "but provisions I will accept." While several men gathered packages of jerky, coffee, and hardtack from their saddlebags, Sarah dismounted with Thomas's help. She approached White Eagle, who had remained on foot throughout their journey. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly, her eyes bright with emotion. White Eagle reached into the pouch at his belt and withdrew the stone with the natural hole, the one he had used to let her hear her baby's heartbeat. He held it out to her. "For the child," White Eagle said, placing the stone in Sarah's palm. "So you remember his spirit song?" Sarah closed her fingers around the smooth stone, its weight cool and comforting against her skin. She understood the significance of the gift, not merely a token of remembrance, but a piece of White Eagle's heritage, a connection to the knowledge his grandmother had passed to him. "I will treasure it," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. "And I'll tell our child about the man who saved us both." White Eagle nodded, satisfaction flickering in his dark eyes. Then, to everyone's surprise, he reached out and placed his hand gently on Sarah's rounded belly. The gesture was so unexpected, so intimate, that several of the watching men shifted uncomfortably. But Sarah remained still, understanding that this was no violation, but a blessing. "Strong heart," White Eagle said softly. "Like mother," He withdrew his hand and straightened, looking at Thomas, who had watched the exchange with wide eyes. "Protect them well, teacher." "I will," Thomas vowed, extending his hand in the white man's gesture of agreement. After a moment's hesitation, White Eagle clasped it firmly. Their eyes met in silent communication, acknowledgement of something altered between them, a boundary crossed that could not be uncrossed. Sheriff Dawson approached, leading his horse, a bundle of provisions secured to the saddle. "These are for you," he said, handing the supplies to White Eagle. "Not payment, like Mitchell said. Just," he searched for the right words, "just one man helping another." White Eagle accepted the bundle with dignity. "The river gives. We give back." "That's as good a way of putting it as any," Dawson agreed, something like respect coloring his weathered features. The other men had already begun descending toward Willow Creek, eager to return to their lives and families, to share the remarkable tale of Sarah Mitchell's rescue. Jenkins lingered, however, awkwardly turning his hat in his hands. "My farm lies east of town," he said gruffly to White Eagle. "My farthest out, by the stand of cottonwoods. If you're ever in need," he trailed off, seemingly embarrassed by his own offer. White Eagle studied the farmer's face, reading the sincerity there. "I will remember." With the farewells complete, White Eagle shouldered his provisions and turned toward the wilderness from which they had emerged. He paused, looking back once at Sarah, who stood with Thomas's arm around her shoulders. Without words, he raised his hand in a gesture of both farewell and blessing. Sarah returned the gesture, tears sliding freely down her cheeks now. They watched as White Eagle disappeared into the trees, his movement so fluid that within moments it was as if he had never been there at all. "Remarkable man," Thomas murmured, his arm tightening around Sarah. "He saved more than just my life," Sarah replied softly, her hand cradling the stone in her pocket. "I think he might have saved something in all of us." The remaining party made their way down the slope toward Willow Creek, where news of their approach had already spread. People lined the main street, women clutching shawls around their shoulders, men with hats removed in respect, children darting between adults for a better view. As Sarah rode into town on her borrowed mare, a cheer went up, spontaneous and heartfelt. Martha Jenkins, the farmer's wife, had ridden ahead to prepare their home. "You'll stay with us tonight," she insisted, helping Sarah dismount. "Your house isn't ready yet, and you need proper rest after such an ordeal." "Thank you," Sarah said gratefully, leaning on the older woman's sturdy arm. The events of the past 24 hours were catching up to her, exhaustion settling into her bones like winter frost. As Thomas helped her toward the Jenkins's wagon, Reverend Collins, a thin man with earnest eyes and a perpetually concerned expression, stepped forward. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, clasping her hand between his, "God has truly blessed your deliverance. When we heard about the wagon," he shook his head, eyes closing briefly in remembered distress, "we feared the worst. God worked through unexpected hands." "Reverend," Sarah replied, her voice gentle but firm. The minister's brow furrowed. "Yes, we've heard the most extraordinary tales already. Something about an Indian." "An Apache named White Eagle," Thomas confirmed, moving to stand beside his wife. He pulled Sarah from the river at great risk to himself, then cared for her through the night. "Without him, I would be burying my wife and child today instead of giving thanks for their safety." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. The story had already been circulating, growing more fantastic with each retelling, but hearing it confirmed by the schoolmaster himself lent it undeniable weight. "And well," Reverend Collins said, clearly struggling to reconcile this information with his preconceptions, The Lord does move in mysterious ways. Perhaps less mysterious than we think, Sarah suggested, too tired for diplomacy. Perhaps we simply fail to see the humanity in those who differ from us. The Reverend blinked, taken aback by such directness from a woman he had previously known as quiet and deferential. But before he could formulate a response, Martha Jenkins intervened. "That's enough excitement for now," she declared, guiding Sarah firmly toward the waiting wagon. "This woman needs rest, not theological debates. You men can sort out the mysteries of providence after she's had a proper meal and sleep." As they drove through town toward the Jenkins farm, Sarah leaned against Thomas, drawing comfort from his solid presence. The stone in her pocket pressed against her thigh, a tangible reminder of her journey. "Are you truly all right?" Thomas asked quietly, his scholar's face lined with concern. Sarah considered the question, her hand moving to rest on her belly where the baby shifted restlessly. "I'm changed," she answered honestly. "But yes, I'm all right." The Jenkins farm was modest but well-maintained, with a sturdy two-room cabin, a small barn, and several fenced fields where spring planting had begun. Martha bustled Sarah inside and directly to the bedroom, where a copper tub of steaming water awaited. "A proper bath first," she announced, already helping Sarah with the buttons of her river-stained dress. "Then food, then rest. Dr. Harris will be by to check on you this evening, but what you need most now is sleep." Sarah didn't argue. The prospect of clean water and fresh clothing was too tempting. As Martha helped her into the tub, the older woman paused, noticing the stone that had fallen from Sarah's pocket. "What's this?" she asked, picking it up curiously. "A gift," Sarah explained, watching as Martha turned the stone, light passing through its natural hole. "White Eagle showed me how to use it to hear my baby's heartbeat." Martha's eyebrows rose. "Did he now? And does it work?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "When you place it against the belly and listen closely, you can hear the baby's heart, strong and fast." Fascination overcame skepticism in Martha's expression. "May I?" she asked, gesturing towards Sarah's rounded abdomen. Sarah nodded, and Martha knelt beside the tub, carefully placing the stone against Sarah's wet skin and leaning close. For a moment, there was only the sound of water dripping from the washcloth. Then Martha's eyes widened. "My stars," she breathed. "I can hear it, like a tiny drum." Sarah smiled, watching the wonder spread across the older woman's face. It was a small moment, insignificant perhaps in the grand scheme of things. And yet, as Martha Jenkins, whose opinions carried considerable weight among the women of Willow Creek, marveled at the knowledge shared by an Apache warrior, Sarah felt the first fragile tendril of hope take root in her heart. Change might come slowly to the frontier, but it would come, one human connection at a time. 2 months passed, bringing summer's heat to Willow Creek. The modest schoolhouse at the edge of town stood completed, a simple one-room building with tall windows to catch the breeze, and a bell mounted in a small tower above the entrance. Inside, Thomas Mitchell arranged wooden desks in neat rows, preparing for the term that would begin the following week. He paused, wiping perspiration from his brow, and gazed at the bookshelf he had built with his own hands. The volumes were few but carefully chosen, primers and arithmetics, a well-worn Bible, several classics of literature, and a book of natural history with colored plates of animals and plants. But what drew his eye was the item centered on the top shelf, a smooth stone with a natural hole, mounted on a small wooden stand. White Eagle's stone. Thomas touched it briefly, remembering. So much had changed since that turbulent day when he'd nearly lost everything he held dear. The stone had become something of a talisman in Willow Creek, not just for Sarah and himself, but for many in the community who had heard the tale of the Apache warrior who saved the schoolmaster's wife. Outside, the sound of wagon wheels announced a visitor. Thomas stepped onto the schoolhouse porch to see Sheriff Dawson climbing down from his buggy, a rolled document tucked under his arm. "Afternoon, Mitchell," the lawman greeted him. "School's looking fine." "Thank you," Thomas replied, extending his hand. "We're nearly ready for the children." Dawson nodded, then glanced around as if ensuring they were alone. "Got something here you should see," he said, unrolling the paper, a rough map of the territory. "Army patrol reported Apache movement near Henderson's Pass." He indicated a spot some 15 miles west. "Thought you should know." Thomas studied the map, his brow furrowing. "Do they anticipate trouble?" "Not saying that," Dawson qualified. "But folks are nervous. The Miller place was raided last month, horses taken, smokehouse emptied. No one hurt, but..." He shrugged significantly. "You think it might be White Eagle?" Thomas asked directly. Dawson sighed. "I don't know. But some are drawing that conclusion. Word of your wife's rescue has spread, and there are those who think you might have information." "I haven't seen or heard from him since that day," Thomas said truthfully. "I figured as much," Dawson replied. "But you might want to prepare Sarah." "There's talk, and not all of it kind." After the sheriff departed, Thomas walked the half-mile to the small cabin he and Sarah now called home. It was a modest dwelling, but sturdy, with a vegetable garden already flourishing behind it. Through the open window, he could hear Sarah singing softly, a lullaby in a blend of English and broken Apache that she had created herself. The baby had arrived 3 weeks earlier, a healthy boy they had named William Eagle Mitchell. The unusual middle name had raised eyebrows in town, but Thomas and Sarah had remained steadfast. Some things were more important than convention. Inside, he found Sarah rocking their son near the fireplace, her face serene in the soft afternoon light. At 21, motherhood had transformed her from a girl into a woman, her features holding a new gravity alongside their natural sweetness. "Thomas," she greeted him with a smile. "You're home early." He bent to kiss her forehead, then gently touched his son's cheek. "Dawson came by the school," he said, deciding on directness. "There's been Apache movement reported nearby." Sarah's hands stilled on the cradle. "White Eagle. They don't know," Thomas admitted, "but there's been a raid on the Miller homestead. Nothing violent, just provisions taken." Sarah considered this, her expression thoughtful. "The Millers live on what was once Apache hunting ground," she observed. "James Miller boasted just last Sunday about how plentiful the game has been." Thomas sat beside her, struck anew by how her perspective had shifted since her ordeal. Before, she had accepted the settlers' narrative without question. Now, she saw complexities where others saw only simple right and wrong. "There's talk in town," he warned gently, "about our connection to White Eagle." Sarah's jaw set in a stubborn line Thomas had come to know well. "Let them talk. He saved my life, saved our son's life. I won't pretend otherwise to ease their discomfort." "Nor should you," Thomas assured her, taking her hand. "So I've been thinking about the school, about what I'll teach the children, and I want to include stories of the native peoples, their history, their relationship to this land before we arrived." He met her gaze steadily. "Not just the conflicts, but their wisdom, their traditions, the truth, as best I can tell it." Sarah's eyes shone. "The school board won't approve." "Perhaps not," Thomas acknowledged. "But I believe it's necessary. These children will shape the future of this territory. They should understand all its peoples." She leaned forward to kiss him softly. "My brave teacher." she murmured, fighting with books instead of bullets. Later that evening, as dusk painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah stood in the doorway of their cabin, William cradled against her shoulder. Something had drawn her outside, an instinct she couldn't name, but had learned to trust since her encounter with the river. At the edge of their property, where the cultivated land gave way to wild prairie grass, a figure stood silhouetted against the fading light. For a moment, Sarah's heart stuttered with uncertainty. Then recognition dawned, and a smile spread across her face. "Thomas," she called softly. "We have a visitor." Miles away, in the foothills where juniper and pine replaced the cottonwoods of the river valley, White Eagle knelt beside a small fire. He was not alone. The remnants of his band, women, children, a few warriors too old or too wise to continue fighting, had joined him in the hidden valley he had discovered months ago, drawn by his tales of water that ran year-round and game that had not yet learned to fear the hunter. It was not the life they had known before the white man came. That life was gone, as surely as the great herds of buffalo that once darkened the plains. But neither was it the confinement of the reservation or the slow death of surrender. It was something new, a way forward through the narrowing path that history had left them. As night fell, White Eagle touched the space at his throat where a stone pendant had once hung, a stone now cradled in the hands of a settler woman and her newborn son. He did not regret the gift. Some connections transcended the boundaries drawn by men on paper maps. Some debts could never be repaid with anything so simple as rescue or provision. The child would be born by now, he thought, strong-hearted, like its mother. Perhaps someday their paths would cross again. 5 years passed, seasons turning like pages in nature's book. Willow Creek had grown, boasting a new general store, a proper doctor's office, and enough children to require an addition to Thomas Mitchell's schoolhouse. The frontier was changing, civilization pushing ever westward, reshaping the land and its peoples with relentless determination. On a crisp autumn morning, 7-year-old Billy Mitchell sat cross-legged on a flat rock by the river, watching the water flow with a child's mixture of fascination and impatience. His father stood nearby, checking the fishing lines they had set earlier. "Pa," Billy asked, his small fingers tracing the outline of a stone with a hole through its center, a stone he wore on a leather cord around his neck. Will we see him today?" Thomas glanced at his son, noting how the morning light caught the boy's dark hair, now grown long enough to touch his shoulders, despite the disapproving looks from some in town. Billy had his mother's blue eyes and fair skin, but there was something in his serious expression, his watchful stillness, that reminded Thomas of someone else entirely. "I don't know," Thomas answered honestly. "He comes when he chooses, not when we expect him." Twice a year since Billy's birth, always at the changing of seasons, they had met White Eagle at this bend in the river. The visits were brief, conducted in secrecy, a necessity in a territory where tensions between settlers and natives still flared into violence with distressing regularity. Sarah appeared on the path behind them, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. At 26, she retained the gentle beauty of her youth, now tempered with the quiet confidence of a woman who had found her place in the world. Beside her walked their daughter, Emma, a sturdy 4-year-old with her father's thoughtful gaze and her mother's determined chin. "Any sign?" Sarah asked, setting down the basket. Thomas shook his head. "Not yet." Billy jumped up suddenly, pointing across the river. "There." They turned to see a solitary figure emerging from the tree line on the opposite bank. White Eagle moved with the same fluid grace Thomas remembered, though he noted new lines etched into the Apache's face. strands of grey beginning to appear in his long black hair. 5 years had left their mark, as they had on them all. White Eagle raised his hand in greeting, then crossed the river at a shallow ford 50 yards upstream. As he approached, Billy ran to meet him, stopping just short of an embrace, respecting the formality that White Eagle maintained, even with those he considered friends. "Your spirit stone," White Eagle said, noting the pendant around the boy's neck. "You wear it well." Billy's hand went to the stone, his face solemn. "Ma says it helped her hear my heart before I was born." White Eagle nodded. "Stone remembers." Carries stories. The adults exchanged greetings, the initial reserve melting into the comfortable familiarity of those who shared a profound connection. Sarah opened the basket, revealing fresh bread, dried venison, and early apples from their tree. A simple meal to be shared between worlds. As they ate, Thomas recounted the year's events in Willow Creek, the new families that had arrived, the progress of his students, the increasing pressure from territorial authorities to civilize the remaining native populations. "The railroad surveyors came through last month," he explained, his expression troubled. "They say the line will reach us within 2 years. White Eagle absorbed this news with outward calm, though Sarah noticed how his fingers tightened around the piece of bread he held. "Iron Horse brings many changes," he said finally. "Not all good." "What of your people?" Sarah asked gently. "Are you well?" A rare smile touched White Eagle's lips. "We live, hunt. Children grow." He glanced at Billy, who was showing Emma how to skip stones across the water's surface. "Some young ones born, our band now 27. The simple report contained volumes: survival against overwhelming odds, the preservation of a way of life that the march of progress had all but condemned. Thomas heard in it both resilience and resignation, the voice of a man walking a vanishing path with dignity. "I've been teaching my students about the Apache," Thomas said, his voice lowering though there was no one to overhear. "Using the stories you've shared with us, the school board doesn't approve, but the children..." He smiled. "They listen, they ask questions." "Good," White Eagle replied. "Questions lead to understanding." "Not everyone wants understanding," Sarah observed sadly. Last month, a missionary visited town, speaking of the need to save the savage soul. Her expression hardened at the memory. "I stood up in that meeting and told them about a savage who saved a white woman and her unborn child when he could have left them to drown." White Eagle studied her face. "Words alone do not change hearts." "No," she agreed, "but silence certainly won't." As they talked, Billy approached, Emma trailing behind him. The boy held something out to White Eagle, a small wooden carving of an eagle in flight, meticulously crafted despite being made by young hands. "I made this," Billy announced, his voice solemn with the importance of the moment. "Pa showed me how to use the knife." White Eagle accepted the gift, examining it with genuine appreciation. "Strong work," he said. "You see with clear eyes." Billy beamed at the praise. "Ma says you're the reason for my middle name, that you saved us both." "Your mother saved herself," White Eagle corrected gently. "I only helped her find the way." The boy considered this, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. "Will you teach me more about the river and the animals, about your people?" A shadow crossed White Eagle's face, not anger or refusal, but a deep sadness that even a child could recognize. Some knowledge not mine to give," he said finally, "belongs to all Apache, but what is mine?" He nodded once. "This I can share." For the next hour, White Eagle showed Billy how to read the river's currents. how to identify animal tracks in the soft mud of the bank, how to listen to the birds whose calls warned of approaching strangers. Emma watched wide-eyed, absorbing everything despite her younger age. Thomas and Sarah observed in silence, understanding the precious nature of this exchange. As the sun reached its zenith, White Eagle rose to his feet. These meetings never lasted long. The risk was too great for all involved. "Wait," Sarah said, reaching into her basket. She withdrew a small journal bound in worn leather. "I've been keeping this since William was born. Stories of our life, of what you taught me." She held it out to him. "I want you to have it so that something of us remains with you as the stone remains with us." White Eagle hesitated, then accepted the journal, his fingers brushing hers in a moment of connection that transcended words. He tucked it carefully into his shirt, close to his heart. "The world changes," he said, his dark eyes meeting Sarah's blue ones. "But some things remain, like river. Always moving, always same." He turned to Thomas, extending his hand in the white man's gesture they had first exchanged 5 years before. "Teach them well, teacher, all your children." Thomas clasped his hand firmly. "I will do my best." To Billy and Emma, White Eagle gave no physical farewell, only a nod of acknowledgement that somehow conveyed more respect than many adults had ever shown them. Then, with the same fluid grace that had carried him into their lives during a raging storm, he turned and walked back toward the river, the sun casting his long shadow before him. They watched him cross the ford and disappear into the trees on the far bank. Billy's small hand found Sarah's, squeezing tightly. "Will we see him again, Ma?" he asked, his voice small against the river's constant murmur. Sarah knelt beside her son, turning him gently to face her. "I don't know," she answered truthfully. "The world is changing very fast, but some connections." She touched the spirit stone hanging around his neck. "Some connections remain, even when we can't see the person anymore." That evening, as Thomas sat on their cabin porch watching the sunset paint the western sky, Sarah joined him, a letter in her hand. "From my sister in Boston," she explained, settling beside him. "She writes that there's increasing debate about the Indian question in Congress. Some are advocating for more humane policies." Thomas took her hand, his expression somber. "Too little, too late for many." "Perhaps," Sarah acknowledged. "But not, I hope, for all." Inside, they could hear Billy recounting the day's lessons to Emma, his voice animated as he explained how to identify deer tracks, which berries were safe to eat, how to listen to the wind's warnings. Already, he was passing on what he had learned, preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost. "He walks between worlds," Thomas observed quietly. "Our son. Not fully of either, but perhaps better for it." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes on the darkening horizon where White Eagle had disappeared, as do we all, in our way. "The question is whether we build bridges between those worlds or walls." In the growing darkness, the river continued its ancient journey, carrying the stories of all who had lived upon its banks, native and settler, past and future, worlds colliding and occasionally, briefly, connecting in moments of shared humanity. The current flowed on, indifferent to human concerns, yet bearing witness to them all, its voice a constant reminder of nature's simple truth, that all things change and all things remain. And somewhere in the foothills, White Eagle sat by his own fire, a leather journal open in his hands, reading the words of a woman whose life had become unexpectedly entwined with his own. Around him, his small band slept peacefully, children who had never known the freedom of the old ways, but who might, perhaps, find their path in the new world that was coming. a world where a boy named William Eagle Mitchell was learning to walk in two worlds at once. The future remained unwritten, the path uncertain. But for tonight, at least, there was this fragile thread of understanding stretching across the divide, a reminder that even in the most turbulent waters, humanity's deeper connections could sometimes, against all odds, endure.